So let's dive straight in and have a little look at 3ds Max design. We're going to run through a workflow today which involves importing geometry from Autodesk Revit directly inside to 3ds Max. This is a workflow that I'm sure many of you are going to be using, not necessarily from Revit but from other applications such as AutoCAD, Inventor, Revit itself, or any third-party applications that are non-Autodesk. You can see that when I've chosen to import this specific FBX file, that it's picked up that it's a Revit file. From here, if I want to, I can edit this preset, which gives me the ability to go through the tree on the left-hand side and choose any specific settings for import and export. For this example, I'm just going to leave that as default and press OK, but it's worth pointing out that you can edit that and then save those settings ready for your next preset. As you can see, it's brought in a simple room from Autodesk Revit. It's also brought across a sunlight system and a camera. I'm just going to delete these now as we shall recreate them again later. I'm also just going to select the roof, right click and hide. We can see that we have a simple room with inside Max. And this has all come directly from Revit. So this room's modelled very well with lots of detail. So the windows and the glass will be double glazed, for example. We're not actually going to do any renders of the staircase, so I'm simply going to delete this out just to make the scene as simple as possible. I'm just going to go to a top view and zoom out, and we're going to choose in this menu on the right hand side to create a camera. We're going to create a target camera in the corner of the room looking to the other corner. I'm just going to go to a side view and just ensure that that camera is situated off the floor and that the target of the camera is a little bit higher, so I can literally press C on the keyboard to select my camera and just move it around using these view options to the bottom right. So I can change my field of view, I can change the orbit of the camera, so where the camera is looking, and I can also change the actual tracking of the camera. Once you've got something that you're happy with and you're looking good, looking correct, we can leave it as that. So let's say we're happy with that, so I'm just going to right click and say unhide all to bring back the roof. So the first thing we want to do is start adding some materials. So we've got this object in from Revit and it will have materials on from Revit, but we want to add our own materials inside of Max. To do so, I'm just going to press M on the keyboard. That brings up the material editor. At this point it's worth pointing out that we have two material editors in Max. We have the compact material editor, which is very much the old way or the classic way of working, and we have the new and improved Slate material editor. This allows us to very quickly create and see textures and materials as we go through in Revit. In Max. So that's what we're going to be using today. First things first, we need to add some material on the walls and on the ceiling. Because we're going to be using the Mental Ray renderer, I'm simply going to add some Mental Ray materials. You'll notice on the left hand side we have a Mental Ray section under which we have Autodesk Wall Paint. I'm just going to select that and drop it in, double click, change the name to simply Wall Paint, change the colour, let's just have a sort of magnolia type colour, just off white, a little bit more orangey yellow, something like that. I'm going to say that that is a flat or a matte finish and that it's been applied using a roller. I also want to create another wall paint material, this time for my ceiling. Let's go straight ahead with a brilliant white finish with a roller. Let's just minimize these so it's just literally the names that we can see. Let's make this smaller. You'll notice that I can pan around which is changing my navigation up there, or I can simply just click around in my navigator. So I'm going to select my ceiling. With my ceiling selected, I'm going to go ahead and apply my ceiling material. With my walls selected, holding Control, I can make sure I go through and select all of my wall materials. Let's just hide the roof to make it a little bit easier. So let's just select 1, 2, 3, 4, all the walls, M for materials, select my wall paint, say that I would like to show the material in my viewport, and press Assign to Selection. We go back to our camera view now, we can see that we have those wall and the ceilings are now painted. The next step will be the floor. So once again I'm going to press M for materials. This time I'm going to add an Arc and Design material. Now if you're using Mental Ray and you don't know where to start with materials, Arc and Design is usually a good place to start. The reason for that is it gives you a very good base to start with. We can select our Arc and Design material, double click to edit and change the name first of all. From the Arc and Design material we can actually go as far as to select a template. So from here we actually want to have a satin varnished wood. You'll see now how easy it is to track a material with the slate editor, in that we have a main material which is linked to a bump map and a bitmap. The bitmap being a JPEG of the varnished floor, and the bump map being a brush, so you can see the brush when the varnish has been added to give the texture some roughness. We can select our Arc and Design material, say that we want to make this viewable in the viewport, select our floor and assign that material to the floor. All looks good so far, apart from the fact that the tiles of this material are far too small. So the way materials work when you have textures, JPEGs, bitmaps, GIFs, etc., is that you essentially have that texture and you have it tiled. In this case, that texture needs to be tiled slightly differently. I can select the floor and do one of two things. I can select Map Scaler, which simply allows me to scale the map size up and down based on my scene. So if I change my scale from 1 to 100, you'll see that it simply scales that specific texture up, making it look much more realistic, like so. We also have the ability, if I delete the Map Scaler modifier, to add something called UVW Map. What UVW Map will do is pretty much the same, but it gives you more options along the way. So we can specify that we're working with a box, a plane, a cylinder shape for example. In this case, even though it's a box, we're only working with the top planar edge. We can say that we don't want to use the real world map size and that we simply want to size this manually. So we can just go ahead and make the wood the exact size that we would like it to be. So let's say we want to go for about 20 by 10. Maybe a little bit different, so let's just knock this down to about 7.5. So we've got long bits of wood and short bits of wood to make it correct to the eye. From here I'm quite happy so far with the result, so let's go ahead and start working on the windows. So let's go ahead and add some materials onto our windows. If we just select the door and have a look at how it's currently set up, we'll notice that we have several different elements within that door object. For example, we have the frame, which is going to be made out of white PVC. We have the window, which is obviously going to be glass. We have the handles, and we have the cross sections across the glass, which are also going to be PVC. So what ideally we want to do, rather than breaking this out into several objects, is we want to be able to determine each different object as a separate material, or each different element as a separate material. So what we can do is have a look at how this is currently set up. So if I select polygon from the right hand side on the editable mesh and click part of the frame, let's just scroll down on the right hand side in the control panel and we can see that the material ID for this selection is set to 2. If I select the door, we can see it's set to 4. If I go to a perspective view, which will enable me to zoom in, if I select a crossbeam, we can see that this is also 4, but if I select the glass, this is 3. So what this means is we can select to have a material that specifies or specifically looks at different material IDs to add different colours or different textures. So what we want to do is add a multi-sub-object material. This multi-sub-object material is broken down into several sub-materials. I've only seen materials 1 to 4 on that door, so I'm just going to delete the ones that I don't think that we need. So first of all, I'm just going to make these a bit smaller, just so I'm not getting overly cluttered, like so. Let's just move this over here. So what we want to do is link a glazing or a glass material to sub-object 3. This means that any polygon with the ID of 3 will be assigned the glass texture. I then want to search for perhaps a PVC material, put that into my scene, and then I want to link textures 1, 2 and 4 to that PVC material. Once again, meaning that any polygons in the door with an ID of 1, 2 or 4 will be assigned that PVC material. I'm just going to double click the PVC material and say that we can view it in the viewport, and I'm going to do the same with the glass as well. With the doors and windows material selected, let's just go ahead with our door selected. As you can see, we can simply press assign to selection and our door becomes white PVC with glass. We now need to do the same thing to the windows. However, in this case, we need to just double check how the windows are currently set up. We need to make sure that the IDs corresponding to the correct piece of information. So let's just select polygon and select our frame. We can see that from the material ID this is currently set to 1, which is fine because that will be assigned a PVC material. I'm more worried about what the glass is going to look like. I've actually just accidentally moved my camera, so let's just push that back into position. Make sure we go into a perspective view so we can move it without affecting our camera, and let's select our glass. We can see that that ID has been set to material ID 2, which is incorrect. That would then be assigned a PVC material, which we don't want. But what we need to do is ensure that both pieces of glass, remember these are double glazed if not triple glazed, all the pieces of glass that are currently ID 2 need to be assigned with ID 3 so that they pick up that glass material. So what I'm going to do is, with polygon selected, I'm going to go in to object selection and put a window across that area. You'll see that this now goes a slightly darker shade of red. What that means is that I've got multi-polygons selected that are pretty much in the same place. Because of that, I can come down here and set the object ID or the material ID for each of those pieces of glass to 3. Because of that, if I assign it this material, like so, because these are all copies, references or instances of the same thing, that will be updated across the board. To make sure this works, I'm simply going to zoom outside of the room, place a simple plane, rotate this up a little bit so we can see it, and simply ensure that when I move this up and down, we can indeed see through the glass on all of the windows and the door, which we can. So this is now working. We have the correct materials assigned to those windows and to the door. So the next step on here is to start looking at how this is going to look when we start rendering it. When we initially imported this, it had sunlight, but we took that out because we wanted to add it within Max directly. We could have left it in, to be honest, but generally when you're going through and setting things up, I tend to put it in towards the end, because when you start to render with sunlight or with daylight, it can take a lot longer. So we're going to put a daylight system in. I'm going to say yes, that because I'm adding a daylight system, I would like to change my exposure control, which we're going to go through shortly, to the recommended settings for this. I'm just going to click and drag to place my compass. This is just for reference with regards to the sun, and then I'm just going to click my mouse again to place the sun. I'm then just going to put it into a perspective view and orbit round ever so slightly. Let's go to my modify panel with daylight selected, and we can see that we have several different settings for position of the sun or the daylight. The first of which is manual, so we can physically select the sun and move it up and around the sky. This allows you to manually place the sun in a location that gives you the result that you're after. We can also place the sun based on a specific date, time and location, which is done through the setup dialog box. And we can also choose to place the sun on the daylight based on a weather data file. And this is generally going to be historic weather data file, which contains information on the sun, time and date, etc. at a specific point in time. For this example, I'm going to go with manual placement, and all I'm going to do is I'm going to place the sun roughly in the middle with regards to its topology, which it is already, and I'm going to place the sun a little bit further away. Obviously, the higher the sun is in the sky, the lighter it's going to be. The lower down it is, it's going to be more like a sunrise effect. To show you that, let's just drop the sun a little bit lower towards the horizon line, which in this instance is here, the 0, 0 line. If I go to my camera and just hit render, let's just leave that a couple of seconds just so it starts the render off. We can see that the render itself looks very, very dark, but we're actually getting that sort of yellowy, orangey, reddish haze coming through the window that you would get at a sunset or a sunrise. If we just cancel that and close the render output window, let's just go back into a perspective view so we can zoom out, and let's just place that sun higher up in the sky. If we go back into our camera and hit render again, we'll be able to see instantly that the room will be a little bit brighter in this instance because the sun is now higher in the sky. It's more daylight. So we can see as this starts to render that we're starting to get an okay result. Apart from the fact that it's very dark, we've already got sunlight coming in and casting shadows on the floor, around the walls, and reflections on the varnished satin floor. We have, however, got quite a lot of speculation in and around the room based on the materials and the current render settings that we have at the bottom. So we've got quite a lot of noise and speculation around here that you can see because there's a lot of dots everywhere, essentially, and in and around the door. So that's mainly based on the quality and the amount of noise that is in the image, so when the sunlight is hitting the glass, what's happening with all the rays of light, etc. At the moment I'm quite happy with this result. Let's just cancel that, and let's look at changing a few options based on the quality of this render. So I'm just going to drop back. Let's just go into a side view. just move the sun back some more and up some more, just to make it even lighter in the house. Go back to our camera, and I'm just going to go to rendering and go to environment. This is where we can set up specific exposure control for our renders. This is where, if you're a photographer or you like to take photographs, you may be more at home with the settings, photographic control, exposure control. You can set up options in here such as shutter speed, your aperture, your film speed, everything that you would kind of get on your digital camera. I'm going to leave the option here for exposure control as MR, so mental ray, photographic exposure control. However, for my exposure, I'm going to select that we are sat indoors in the daytime. I'm also going to up my exposure value to 12. If I hit render preview, this will go away, and in this small square here we will get a render or a preview of what it's going to look like when we finally render our scene. While we're not going to be able to see the actual quality of the render from such a small image, it gives us a general idea of brightness of the image, if the colour's looking correct, and what's going on. So we can see that actually, although we can still see a lot of noise or a lot of speckles or speculation on the right hand wall there, we're actually getting not a bad result. If you imagine that you're sat in a room and the sun's shining in, if you've got no lights on, you would expect to see darker shadows around the wall that the sun isn't touching. So we're actually getting quite a realistic result there straight away. And you can also see, oops, I've just moved my wheel on my mouse, which is just reset those settings. Let's just go back. We can also see that we've got, as well as the reflections of the windows, we also have a light beam that's coming in and casting a light beam on the floor. So with regards to those settings, I'm quite happy with those, so I'm going to leave those as they are. But you can go as far as to manually set photographic exposure control and image control should you want to each one of your renders. Once again, if you're into your photography, or if you like to play around with settings on cameras to get you different options and different results, this is where you can really start getting some very fine and very good results with your renders. So let's just close that. What I want to do now is specify that there's going to be light able to come through these windows and react with the rest of the scene. To do that, I actually need to create a type of light that's called a sky portal. So again, you can see this MR, or mental ray. So this is a mental ray sky portal. This is telling the renderer, in our case mental ray, that it can use information from this sky portal, which will take light from a light source and shine it through, in our case, a piece of glass. So I've just created a sky portal on the floor, and I'm just going to rotate it around so it's facing the correct location. From here, I can just move this around and place it where I would like to place it. In my case, over one of the windows. We can play around with the modify just to make sure that this is roughly the right size. It doesn't need to be exact, just needs to be roughly the correct size. So let's just go into my perspective view and just have a little rotate around. In this instance, I'm just going to remove this wall and hide it, just to make sure that we're coming in the correct location or the correct direction with the light, which we are. So from here, I'm just going to simply select my sky portal, and I'm going to choose to copy it five times. I'm then just going to move each one of these roughly into position so that it's placed over each one of the pieces of glass. Again, you'll notice that I'm not being mega precise, I'm just kind of making sure that they're roughly in the correct position. You can be more accurate if you want to, but it won't have too much of a bearing in an example like this. Let's just make sure that this one's a little bit further over to the right, just so it's not affecting the shadows on the floor in any way. So that's about right. That's kind of what I want to do. So let's just go to render, environment once more, and use that render preview once again. At this state we probably won't see a great deal of difference because those sky portals currently aren't doing much. You'll notice while that's rendering the preview that we have some parameters for those sky portals on the right hand side. One of which is a multiplier. So that's telling Mental Ray, in this case the renderer, how much that's going to multiply the light as it comes through the room. So what you can see has happened is that it's actually not given us too bad a result. It's actually slightly better than I thought it was going to be. It takes the light through the window and it essentially says light's coming in through the window, it's going to expand, it's going to hit the floor, it's going to hit the walls, and everything's going to react the way it should, and therefore it will light up the inside of the room, which is what you would expect in real life. So it's kind of given us a result that's not bad. So I'm not actually going to change these modifiers or these multipliers at all. If you were still getting a result that's too dark, you would simply up those multipliers on the right hand side a little bit. You also notice you have an option in there to be able to take shadows from the outside. So if you had something outside that was casting shadow inside, you could get that to come across as well. From my point of view, I'm completely happy with the way that's currently set up. So let's just hit the render button. Let's just leave this rendering for a minute or so, just to see the result that it's going to give us so far. Just to see on if there's any other areas for now where we can start working on. We are obviously limited with time that we have on today's session, so we're not going to be able to go through all the ins and outs on how to get this render absolutely perfect. But we want to kind of see where we can start to work, what areas we can start to work on to make this render look as realistic as possible. Again, you can see across the top of the wall and on the ceiling we've still got quite a lot of speculation and quite a lot of noise. Once again, there's not that much we can do with that until we start changing some of these settings, such as the image precision and the final gather precision. Those sliders will affect the overall quality of the image and therefore reduce things like your noise and your speculation. So at the moment I'm not too worried about those, because I know that when we up those settings later on, to get your final production quality render, you're going to get a much nicer and a much more solid overall render. So without needing to wait for this render to finish, we can kind of see that the result we're going to get is okay. While I've said we have still got a lot of noise, especially around the ceiling, the top of the roof, around the windows and on the shadows and reflections here, we're getting quite a good result. We're getting a little bit of realism with regards to the soft lighting, and we're getting quite an overall good result. It's starting to come together, certainly. What we're going to do is just cancel this render and start working on the next stage of making our image look a little bit more realistic. So at the moment we're in a room looking outside of a window into nothingness. To make something look more realistic, you need to add more detail. For example, on the outside of this room, we can add some detail to make this look prettier as an image, but generally make the overall appearance look more appealing and more realistic. If you can make something look appealing and realistic, it will generally look more appealing and realistic, if that makes any sense whatsoever. So let's just create a plane. What we want to do is create a small decking area out the front of this room. So I'm just going to create a plane, nip back into my camera view and just see whereabouts this plane needs to go. Let's say roughly about there. From there, if we want to make this into a deck, we don't need to do much other than find a suitable material and place it on this plane. So let's press M for materials. Let's just zoom out a little bit and let's just add a bog standard 3ds Max material. So not a Mental Ray material, just a standard Max material. I'm just going to double click this and select decking. and I'm just going to go for maps and add a diffuse colour map. I'm going to choose a bitmap to choose an image that I have somewhere on my machine, and I'm going to go and find a decking material that I made earlier, so to speak. So with this material, I'm going to say that I would like to view it in the viewport, and I want to assign it to my current selection. We can instantly see that our viewport updates, but things aren't quite perhaps correct. First of all, the image is going in the wrong direction, and it's maybe a little bit too small. Again, just like we did with the floor earlier, we can change these settings, or change the scale of this image. So we can go in and we can either use map scaler, as we did earlier, to simply scale upwards and downwards. We can also use UVW map to do the same thing, but with slightly more options. So all I'm going to do is simply rotate my object and swap the length and the width, like so. This gives me the result I'm after with regards to the direction of the decking there. And now I can go ahead and add my map scaler. I don't want to be too accurate in this instance, I just want to make those slightly bigger. So I'm just going to scale that up to 2. We go back to our camera, we can see that that decking is clearly visible and is going to look okay from that point. So let's drop back to my perspective view, and let's say that in front of that deck we want to add a fence. So obviously 3ds Max gives you the ability to model directly within, and this is very useful if you want to create very quick models within your scene. So using standard primitive objects, we can draw things such as 3D boxes very quickly. I'm just going to modify these options just to make this a little bit more accurate with regards to, or a little bit more rounded up with regards to sizes, like so. I've also split this box into 5 length, width and height sections. Because of that, from the modifiers list, I can select to change this to an editable poly. Because it's an editable poly, I can literally pick up any one of those polygons and modify it with movements, rotations, extrusions, bevels, inserts, bridges, etc, etc. In this case I don't need to do any of that. All I want to do is simply smooth the top polygons and the bottom polygons using M smooth or mesh smooth. Once I've done that, I am probably quite big with regards to a fence post, so let's just scale it down a little bit, like so. So now we've scaled it down, let's just move it into a more appropriate position, just so it's situated correctly. Again, it doesn't need to be exact, so I'm just going to move it slightly below the deck, which is about there. Let's go back to our perspective view, and let's just move with holding down Shift to copy that several times along the length of the deck. From that point, if I wanted to make the horizontal bars, I could, for example, quite easily hold down Shift and rotate to copy this beam, and then once again simply just move it roughly into position. The great thing about 3ds Max is you don't have to be absolutely spot on with regards to the measurements. It is very much make it how it looks good. So you don't have to be that accurate with regards to measurements if you don't want to be. So for this instance, I just want to build a fence that we can see through the window, so it doesn't need to be fully accurate. So from there, let's just make a lower section and then copy that across just like we did before 5 times or so. we can see that we've lost a little bit of movement in the fact that they're not quite in the correct position. So we can just go ahead and select all of those and move them as a single unit, just to again make sure that they are near enough in the correct position. We also need to add a final fence post on the end. Once your fence has been modelled up as required, it's just a case of finding and adding a material that will bring your fence to life and make it look as it should. So from here you can see that I've quickly finished the fence. So we've got a complete fence there. It's not the most detailed fence in the world, but at the end of the day we're going to be viewing it from the other side of this room through a window. So we only need to have a small amount of detail on there. The material will do the job, as will the sunlight hitting the fence and casting shadows on the deck. At the end of the day, with a render like this, the amount of material and the amount of detail that you have in the foreground will lead your eyes to believe that the same amount of detail exists in the background. So with our fence complete, all I want to do now is, let's say that this deck is sat on top of a lake. So let's just go ahead and add a plane. I'm just going to drop that plane down a little bit, go into my camera view and just kind of have a look from here and get this roughly in a position that looks how I want it to look. In other words, if you look at the right hand side of the window there, I want to make sure that the corner of that plane is past the final window over here. So it looks like it's one solid piece of water. We also want to make sure it's slightly below the deck as it would be in real life. So I've already got a water material for this. If I press M for materials and just drop into my compact material editor, you'll see that we've created a water material. This water material is simply just using the Autodesk Water template. This allows us to specify what kind of water we would like, the colour, the wave height, and any specific options resulting in an output for that material. I'm going to specify that I would like to see this material inside the viewport and assign it to that selection. With water, it won't display 100% correct, but you'll get the right kind of colour. If I just zoom in to this corner and hit render, let's make sure that we don't render to a file. We should just about be able to see on the first view that we start to get a half decent realistic looking water material. Just wait for the next couple of sections to become clear. Let's just cancel that, as that will take a very long time on those settings. Let's just drop that back. To something more reasonable. Hit render again, just to show you what that water texture is going to look like. So as you can see, it's essentially a blue material with a noise or a displacement map on there, just to give it those waves. But essentially it looks like water, especially as we're going to be once again looking from the other side of a room through a window. The final thing we want to do is perhaps add another plane at the back of the model with a backdrop on. A little bit Blue Peter style. I'm just going to delete that water and just unhide some that I've created earlier that have just been placed in the correct position to make them look as good as possible on the render. So it's a little bit further away and a little bit lower than the room for the water itself, and that's been placed around about midway on this backdrop image. And there's nothing special about this backdrop image, it's simply a material, a standard material with a JPEG that's been assigned to this plane. But essentially when we go to our camera, what we can see, let me just go in and hide these ever so slightly. We can see the deck, the fence, the water or the lake, with the backdrop at the back along with the reflections of that in the lake. And once again, because you're going to a lot of detail this end in the foreground, people's eyes will lead them to believe that there's that much detail in the background. I've also just modelled up a Man and Machine logo to place on the wall. So from here, let's just make sure that those settings are still quite low, because there is quite a lot of detail in here now, and I just want to make sure that I get a render result out relatively quickly, just to have a look at what the lighting is going to look like, what the reflections are going to look like, what the water and the background is going to look like before I finally render this off as a finished image. So this is just going to take a couple of seconds just to compute this final render. As you can see, it's very noisy or pixelated in certain areas, and that's because of this setting down here. However, what we want to just check before we set this off on a final render is that everything looks right, everything looks like it's in the right position. Generally, we've got a very nice softly lit room with some nice soft shadows in the corners and on the roof. We have some very nice reflections and lighting coming in through the windows, along with some nice reflections from the fence on the deck, and some a very good or very nice result with the background and the water. If we throw this all together and turn these up as far as they will go, what we get is an image result that looks something like this. If we move these out of the way, we have an image that looks very crisp and very clear. We have some very nice soft shadows, not just in the corner, but around any detail as well, around the Man and Machine logo on the right hand side, and around the inside of the windows. For this render, I took the sky portals off of the door just to make the render time decrease a little bit, just to make it a little bit quicker. That's why we don't have the shadows around the inside of the door. We have the decking, which, remember, is just that plane with the material added to it, and we have our very simple fence, which does its job quite nicely with a white paint texture. What really brings this image to light is when you start seeing the water. The water texture quality is very high, and we've also got the reflection off that JPEG image in the background, which is showing in the water, as you can see, roughly around here, with the slightly darker areas. All in all, it gives us a very nice, pleasing, and pretty realistic looking render, which didn't take that long inside of 3ds Max. This render overall on my laptop, which is running a quad-core i7 processor and 12 GB of RAM, took about 3 to 4 hours. So it's quite a long render. However, that is running off a laptop. If any of you have got workstation machines that are running Xeon processors perhaps, you're going to get a much faster result. Hopefully that's been useful and given you an insight or an overview of 3ds Max and rendering with 3ds Max using data from existing CAD systems and creating new models, for example the fence inside of 3ds Max, and hopefully shown how it's not that difficult to get an image of this sort of quality out of Max.